maybe if you could briefly tell us, for our listeners who may not know policy as code as such, if you could briefly simplify that for them, as what is policy as code?
So policy as code is basically, I think the simplest way to explain policy as code is all the controls you thought you wanted, right? So today, let's take a simple example. I'll use an example because I think examples everybody will understand and appreciate. Now, let's say I am running an organization. I have a bunch of applications that are deployed. Now, let's say a developer who has access to things, right? So let's say the developer has access to an environment, they're authenticated, they're authorized, they have all of that stuff, they have those privileges, but they end up deploying an application with root username and password to production. Let's say that happens. Now, the idea behind policy as code, the problem with that kind of a scenario typically is that you always need to have, we are used to doing post-mortem analysis, right? We're used to saying that we scan something with a vulnerability scanner, like whatever, Nessus or something, and then we find, hey, this has Tomcat on the web server. But what if we could implement a policy that would not even allow default password, applications to be launched on that particular web server, or applications with a poor password to even get launched in a particular given production environment? What if we could implement a policy that mandated and essentially forced that developer to use a strong credential before they even deploy? And what if that policy was not just written as a nice, beautiful statement on a docx or a PDF? What if that was enforced through some kind of a tool which you could codify, which you could essentially manipulate, which you could essentially control in a way that you can scale it out? So that's basically policy as code. The idea behind policy as code is that you should be able to take any type of security authorization policy, any kind of security policy, and convert that into code. The idea behind converting that into code is because you can deploy that into any environment or any target environment, and that target environment automatically starts enforcing that policy for you from that point in time. So the idea is that it's automated and it is as code, because as code gets more traction, right? You can have developers write it, you can check it into a Git repository, you can test it, you can do all of that stuff. So as code becomes a very important part of the policy as code part of it. So that's really what policy as code is about.
Thanks. I think that's very well simplified and put for the listeners. But when we think about policy and as code, right, we are now talking about, particularly at an org level, we are talking about a lot of things.
Yes.
And the first thing that comes to mind is there are various aspects to the policy itself, right? A security
Yes.
policy will have various aspects, and there are
Yes.
multiple considerations when it comes to that. For example, there may be different data points, data sets that you have to consider.
Yes.
Whether it is business data, sensitive data, how you handle that. Plus, there'll be network configurations, right? And there'll be compliance requirements for that
Yes.
matter. There'll be regulatory requirements that will come in. And on top of that, you will also have, as a security team, to think about what about the access control? Now, who gets access to what?
Yes.
And in any medium to large size organization, that can be quite overwhelming. So
Yes.
in your opinion and in your experience particularly, where should we start and what should we prioritize when it comes to even thinking of policy as code for our organizations?
Yeah, no, that's a very valid question, and I think that is a question that needs a lot of practical thought. So if you think about where I would, so let me talk about it from a personal perspective, as well as what I've seen work with our customers and clients and people I speak to, in the broader industry. So wherever I feel that the first place you should start policy as code is wherever there are APIs for it, right? See, the problem is that today you have a lot of legacy systems, you have a lot of legacy environments, things like that. You may not be able to do policy as code for them to begin with. You may be able to, over time, mature your policy as code implementation into all of those things. But you need to have APIs that support this sort of an implementation first. And those systems should be configurable entirely through the API. Right, that's very important. So, which is why if you see traditionally, I would say that, when traditional is a very big word in IT because our traditional is about 6 months old. I'm saying if you look at the last couple of years in policy as code, the most amount of policy as code implementations have gone into Kubernetes, largely. The reason for that being Kubernetes is entirely API. So, which is why people they've built products around it, they've built open source products around it, commercial products around it. And that's why the concept of policy as code has really gotten a lot of traction because of Kubernetes. But if you look at it otherwise, you've generally not seen that without Kubernetes, for instance, it would have been a much slower ride for policy as code. So I would say wherever the ideal starting point should be where API configuration is entirely possible through the API, right? Wherever you have API-driven systems where you can configure this, it could be on the cloud. So for instance, Azure has a pretty solid policy engine. AWS has a pretty solid policy engine. Kubernetes has a bunch of tools that you can use for policy as code. Again, these are entirely configurable through API. So these systems, I would say, start with them because you don't want to start saying, hey, you know what, this application was built in the 1980s. Let's start applying policy as code to this super legacy application that we are deploying from the 1980s onwards. It's not going to work simply because that application probably is deployed in a legacy and infrastructure. It probably has several considerations that does not even touch, an API gateway or any other API endpoint. So there's a good chance that you'll not be able to do that. So don't try and take on such projects to begin with. You can probably, as your stack matures and as your policy as code matures, as the other parts of your infrastructure mature, that's when you can start taking up more complicated, more challenging projects.